Well, to Genesis chapter 22. When you find your place, we go ahead and stand tonight. Genesis 22. I know Brother Rick preached out of Genesis 22. I think it was 2 weeks ago, so I made sure to give a little bit of gap in there, so that way it wasn't back-to-back Wednesdays you were listening to Genesis 22. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 22, starting in verse 1 this evening. It says, "And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee in the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up, and went unto the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes, and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and laid it upon Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand, and a knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together, and they came to the place which God had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham, hey, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know that thou fearest God, seeing that thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram, and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. We'll stop there for right now. Let's have a word of prayer. Lord, I want to thank you for the time we can have tonight in your word and hearing from you. Lord, I pray that you will use this message. Lord, I pray that you will speak through me tonight, Lord. Help me not to get in the way of your word this evening. Lord, I pray this in your name. Amen. You can go ahead and be seated. So this evening we're going to continue on with the series we've been on Wednesday nights on choices, decisions that we have to make. And we're going to look a little bit of a transitioning spot. I said a few weeks ago that we're going to be spending at least a few Wednesdays looking at Abraham, which we have been. Tonight it's going to be the transition from Abraham to Isaac. And I believe this transition can be important for us to see. Brother Jance, I don't know why, there is a lot of monitor right now. I'm getting sick of hearing my own voice, and we're only like a minute into this. But it's really loud up here. All right, so this transition, I believe this transition is important for us to see. And we're going to get into more of this as we go. But in these verses that we read and that we'll look at in the message, that both of them make multiple choices, Abraham and Isaac. And I want to add multiple very hard choices. Not easy things to decide, but I think this transition is important for us to see because it highlights the fact that the choices that are made by Abraham affect his son. Affect more than just himself. Very often when we read this passage, we look at, and rightfully so, but we look at the faith of Abraham in this passage. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but we see Abraham, we see his willingness to obey God in what would be a very hard decision, what would be a very difficult thing, and we often miss the fact that his choice has a profound effect on on his son, on his wife, and on all that are involved. And realistically, it goes a lot further than that. Isaac is the son through which God had promised to bring a nation. This choice that Abraham makes here, the choice that Abraham made to obey God and sacrifice his son, affected the future of a nation. And here's why I think, just starting us off, why I think that's important for us to see and to point out is because we very often get the mindset the choices I make and the things that I do only affect me. That I can make a choice and I can make a decision and I can do this and no one else will get hurt. We get this thought that if I do this and it's the wrong choice, I'm the only one affected. No one else is going to have to face the problems that I cause, and it simply isn't true. We miss the fact that others are affected by and hurt by often the choices, the decisions that we make. We look at Abraham very often with this, but can you imagine how Sarah felt as she watched her husband take her son up that hill? I have to think she knew what was going on. If it's a typical husband and wife relationship, I have to think that he talked to her about what God had said to him. I have to think she knew what was going on. I have to think that she was aware. Can you as a parent imagine the hug that she gave her son before he left, thinking this was the last time? I mean, can you imagine the goodbyes that you would be giving, thinking, well, this is the last time I'm going to see my son? I mean, imagine the emotions of this mom as she watches them walk away. The point being the choices that Abraham made to follow God here affected more than just Abraham. And the same is true for you and I. Like I said, we get that mindset that what I do and the things I choose only affect me, so I can choose to do what I want, and even if it's a bad choice, well, I can live with the consequences. But who else has to? Who else has to? Think about this. Husbands, the choices that you make not only directly affect you, but they also directly affect your wife. We get this, I'm the man of the house and I make the decisions mindset, and we forget how those might affect our wife. And I say we on purpose. I understand I've done this. My wife has been amazing because over the past 15 years, I know, looking back, the whole hindsight's 20/20 thing, I know looking back, I've made some really dumb decisions in the last 15 years. And a lot of those that I look back at and think, I had no idea how it would affect her, what she was going to have to deal with because of decisions I made, because the choices that we make affect others. Husbands, our choices directly affect our kids. I think it's pretty clear to see. My kids all still live at home, so they have very little choice in a lot of things. I'm not one of those dads that has a family meeting and is going to let everyone have a vote. If I ever did, it would be my vote outranks all of theirs, so it doesn't really matter. But my kids have very little choice in some of those things, but what I choose directly affects them. The house I choose to live in, the cars I choose to drive, the things we choose to do, and on we could go with that. Choices that they have no say in at all. That the husband, the dad makes directly affects them. And the example that I gave, the examples that I gave are all physical examples, but the same applies spiritually. The choices that you make affect them directly. Choice that you make also, as again, still on husband and dad, the choices that you make also affect some indirectly. People you may never know. People that you may never meet, but because you affected your children, then they affect someone else down the line, just like this choice of Abraham would have affected Isaac, who would have affected a nation. Choices a husband makes affects a lot more than just him. You look at it from the wife's side. The choices that you make affect a lot more than just you. My dad has said this for years. I think he got it from another relative of ours. I think my great-grandma, but I'm not sure on that the husband is the head of the home, but the wife is the neck that turns the head. Am I right that it was okay, I thought it was my great-grandma that said that. The choices that you make affect your family. Being honest here, the husband can be as macho about it as he wants, but we all know that if mama ain't happy, nobody's happy. So the choices that she makes affects her husband. I'm not going to preach on that, or I'm going to get myself in trouble. The choices that she makes affects her husband. It affects her children. It affects those who her family comes in contact with down the line, because our decisions affect more than just you. And really, it's no different with kids. A kid could say, well, I'm the youngest, and I don't have a family of my own yet, so how can what I choose affect others? But it does. The reality of the matter is there is no choice that you or I make that only affects you. That's what we see an example of in this passage with Abraham and Isaac. So tonight I have three choices made by these two that both of them made that I want us to focus on for this evening's message. The first is they both made a choice of faith. Both Abraham and Isaac had a choice of faith here. Let's look first at Abraham. Verses 2 and 3 again. It says, and he said, take now thy son, this is God talking to him. He said, take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place of which God had told him. Abraham trusted God's plan. Now I know that I pointed this out from the mom side, and I recognize that typically dads aren't as emotional, but non-emotional or not, this is a hard thing that God just asked Abraham to do. Again, it doesn't matter how macho, I never shed a tear of a guy you are. This is a hard thing that he's asked to do. Remember the backstory a little bit. Remember the years of struggle waiting on this son. This was the promised son that they had been waiting for so long. This is the son that they had doubted God was going to be able to give them, so they made their own way. This is the son that God miraculously gave them, and now not only is God saying that he's going to take that son, but the way God was asking Abraham to do it. Asked to sacrifice his own son. From a dad's side, I can't even imagine. I can't. My wife and I have been blessed with 3 kids, and I can't imagine how I would respond if God asked me to sacrifice one of them. It's easy for us as a parent to say that we're giving our kids to God. This is a whole different level. One of those situations, I would hope that I would respond like Abraham and obey God. That's a really hard thing. Did you notice in reading those verses, nowhere does it show Abraham arguing with God? Which is worth note, because when God came to judge Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham did. So we know Abraham's not above stepping in and saying, well, God, are you sure about this? But he didn't here. Just says God told him to do it, and he rose up the next morning and did it. He trusted that God had a plan, even if he didn't know what it was. Abraham trusted that God would take care of them, even though I'm confident he didn't understand why God would ask him to do this. He trusted God's plan. While studying for this, I was doing some searching stuff out for this, and I found it interesting how many people, people will do the asking questions online and let everyone else answer. How many people ask the question, why would God have him do this? I'm going to bet Abraham had that same question in his mind. Why? Doesn't make sense. But he trusted God's plan. Just obeyed. Let's look at it from Isaac's side. Isaac trusted his dad's leading. Look at verse 7 and 8 with me again. It says, and Isaac spake unto Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here am I, my son. And he said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went up, the both of them, together. Again, imagine this conversation being had here. Isaac is no dumb kid. Bible doesn't give us the exact age of Isaac at this point. I did. I told you I did some searching. I always love doing that because you find such a broad range. I found everything from he was 5 to 37. Pastor and I talked about it a little bit and estimated between 14 and 20. So I'm going to go with that. I'm sure by this point, if you're going with that, 14 to 20 years old, he's seen a sacrifice before. He knows the routine. He knows the elements that are going to be needed, and that's seen by the fact that he's walking with his dad and says, hey, we're missing something. I'm sure by this point he's seen sacrifices happen before. He knows what the routine is of this, so they get walking out there with the servants and the animals packing all their gear, and at a certain point Abraham stops everyone and says, okay, you're all going to stay here. Myself and Isaac, we're going to go alone from here. The two of them take all the stuff, load it on themselves, and they go up the mountain where God had led him. And somewhere along the line, again, Isaac notices, Dad, we've got everything else. We're missing the animal. I see the fire, I see the wood, I see the knife, no lamb. And Abraham's response is, it's okay, God's going to provide it. And much like when God gave this direction to his father, Abraham, Isaac doesn't argue. Isaac doesn't question Dad. If Isaac is 14 to 20, Dad is well over 100 years old right now. It's not like Isaac's going, boy, Dad has lost it. He's having dementia, and he forgot that we need a lamb, and now he's just too proud to admit it. No, he doesn't question him. Remember, they're climbing a mountain. That's no easy task, and it's going to be a pretty big bummer if you get to the top, and then you realize, oh, we have nothing to sacrifice. That was a waste of energy. But he doesn't fight with his dad on it. He just chooses to trust his dad's leading. Abraham tells him, this is what God told us to do, so he does it. Both Abraham and Isaac didn't know all the details of what was going on. Neither of them understood why this was happening. Again, thinking of it from Isaac's side, Abraham telling him God will provide himself a lamb. That's never happened before in Isaac's experience. They've always brought the lamb. Didn't understand why this was happening, but God said do it, and they trusted his leading. That's a choice that wasn't new to Abraham. He's had to make that before of following where God was leading, though he didn't understand it, didn't know where. But this is new for Isaac. And yet the example that we see in both, they choose faith. They chose to trust God. They chose, they made a choice that every one of us need to make. I know in this series I've said it a lot, and as I've studied for this series, I think I'm going to continue to say it a lot, but the choice to have faith, to obey God, is one we need to make daily. Parents, we need to make the choice constantly to lead our families by faith. Showing our family that in this house, we live by faith. We trust God. Kids, making the choice to have faith that when your parents say this is of God, you trust their leading. Abraham and Isaac chose faith. The second choice I want us to see tonight is a choice of submission. again, let's look at it from the view of both of these guys. Abraham, and I know I already somewhat touched on this, but Abraham submitted. He didn't argue. He didn't fight. He didn't try to come up with an alternative. Remember, he had done that before. That's what he did with Ishmael. With Ishmael, he made his alternative plan and then asked God if he could just use that plan. He obviously learned from that lesson in that scenario, so that when God told him this is what he wanted him to do, though it was going to be extremely hard, though it was going to be painful, he submitted to the will of God. I said it earlier, as a parent, I don't think we can imagine how hard it would be. But he submitted that this is what God led him to do. So whether it's what he wanted or not, whether this was easy or not, this was exactly what he's going to do. But let's view it a little bit from Isaac's side. Look at Isaac. Again, verse 9 and 10. They came to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And it goes on from there. Now remember, Isaac is perhaps between 14 and 20 years old, which would make Abraham well over 100 years old. So they get to the top of a mountain. You can't convince me that Abraham is spry and energetic. He's not a young man and just climbed a mountain. Then add to that, and now at the top of the mountain, they have to build the altar, which is also work. So now you're taking a toll on this guy. And now after all that, Abraham, at 100+ years old, overpowers his 20-year-old son and ties him up and lifts him and puts him on an altar. No, that's not what we see happening at all. They get to the top of this mountain, and Abraham and Isaac together build the altar, and Abraham and Isaac together lay the wood in order, and Isaac submitted to allow his dad to tie him up on the altar. I mean, let's just be realistic here. There's no way that this 100-plus-year-old man overpowered his 20-year-old son and then lifted him onto the altar. He willingly submitted. Isaac could have fought back and won. Isaac could have told his dad, there is no way I'm laying on that altar. And I truly believe this, that there's no physical way Abraham could have forced him. Fathers and sons always have that moment that they realize the dad is no longer stronger than his dad, or that the dad is no longer stronger. That didn't make sense. They reach that moment, they realize that the dad is no longer stronger than the son. However that happens, I'm pretty sure by the age of 100 plus, that's happened here. I mean, Isaac is in his prime, Abraham is not. So how is it that he's bound on the altar with his dad over him with a knife ready to sacrifice him? It's because much like his father, Isaac submitted. He made the choice, put it this way, against what he would have wanted, to submit. Reminds me of the choice that Jesus made in the garden. Not my will be done, or not my will, but thine be done. Jesus didn't have to. He could have left. He could have been delivered from the mob. He could have chosen something different, but he submitted to the will of the Father. Choice to submit. That's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to do. It used to be that it was said mostly about men because men are conquerors. They claim that it's in our nature that we always want to conquer, and we're fighters by nature, and people who are conquering and fighting have a hard idea with the idea of submitting. If you're a conqueror and a fighter, you want to make someone else submit, not you submit. But I think in reality, it's a choice that is just as hard, no matter if you're male or female, because we don't like to submit to someone else's way or someone else's plan. When we submit, it shows that who we submitted to is superior, that I'm less than. Or at least that's how we feel. We feel like it makes it makes me inferior, but hard or not, it's an important lesson that we learn to submit to the will and plan of God. We come to the place that when God says it, we simply obey. Not argue it, not try to come up with our own alternative plan, not fight back against it or resist. Simply come to the place of, not my will, but thine. Abraham and Isaac, they chose faith. Abraham and Isaac chose submission. And then lastly tonight, Abraham and Isaac, I'm going to word it this way, they chose recognition. Look at verse 11 through 13 with me. It says, "And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son." Think for a minute of all that God has done. God has, in this moment, God has saved the life of Isaac. For Abraham and Isaac, this is obviously big. This is Abraham's son, though he was willing to do, though he was willing to obey God and follow through with this, though he was willing to surrender to God's will. There's no way this is easy for him, and from Isaac's side, this was his life that had just been saved. If something comes along and saves your life, I mean, that's going to be a big deal. And that's not even viewing it as the picture of salvation that just happened here with God sending a sacrifice to die in Isaac's place, but God has just saved his life. You think about what God has done here. God had in this preserved a nation. I kind of brought this up in at the start of the message, that this is the son that is going to bring a nation. I think often we're guilty of looking at things and viewing it in the smallest terms, which in this case, the smallest terms is still a big deal. You think about this, the smallest terms of this is Isaac's life was saved. But let's for a second look at the big picture. Again, Isaac was the one who God promised a nation would come from. That's going to be a pretty big challenge if Isaac is dead. I mean, just saying it bluntly, God saving the life here of Isaac preserved the life of the nation that would be God's people. What God did here was no small thing, and notice how Abraham and Isaac reacted, because if we're really honest, the reaction I would have wanted would have been to run home and tell what just happened. Or at least to run away from Abraham if I was Isaac, get some distance from the man with the knife. But, that would be our reaction. Maybe to run down to the guys that you left lower on that mountain with the animals to tell them. I can see Isaac. I have a pretty good imagination. I can see Isaac telling the story, running down to those guys. You won't believe what my dad was going to do. He was holding the knife over me, ready to slay me. But guess what God did instead? Or you get back home to mom and tell her all about how God provided a ram in the thorns and the whole story. And I'm sure those happened. I'm sure they went and told all about that. God works in your life in that sort of way. You're going to want to tell people, but notice before running down the hill and before telling those lower down what happened, and before going home and regaling the happenings of the day, they sacrificed to God. They worshiped. And at that moment, they had a lot to be thankful for. They chose to stop and recognize what God had done. They didn't get so caught up in it that they wanted to celebrate what had happened for them. They chose to recognize the way God had stepped in. To recognize the way he had worked. Those three choices that they faced are decisions that we face on a regular basis. So here's the application portion of the message. First, choose faith to trust God. Again, I said this is something we have to choose on a regular basis. Choose to trust His leading, His guiding, His way, even when it doesn't make sense. Know that He knows what's best for you. Choose submission. It's one thing to know what God wants you to do. It's an entirely different thing to do it. I think there are a lot of people who feel like they know where God is leading. They're just not willing to submit and actually do it. Choose that you're going to submit to the will and way of God so that you can truly say, not my will, thine be done. And then choose to recognize what God has done. I don't know how many times I've said this in messages. God is working in our lives more often than I think we realize. And more often than not, I think we miss it. And if we do see it, we're often guilty of not recognizing it was Him. And we may get excited about it. We may tell someone what happened. We may regale the story, but not stopping to thank Him for what He did. Here's how I want to wrap up tonight. Really simply, let's choose to trust God. Let's choose to submit to His will and way. And then let's choose to recognize what He's done in our lives. Because He is working. Pray. Lord, I pray that You will help us this evening to be able to be able to learn from this, Lord, the choices that they made. And as I study this, I couldn't help but think these are all decisions that we can look at their example and we can see, and that we all are faced with on a regular basis. It's a common thing that we are faced with the decision, am I going to have faith to trust God in this? Or am I going to lean to my own understanding? The common thing that we're faced with the choice of, am I going to submit to God in this? Or am I going to resist? The common thing that You work in, as we see in this passage, a miraculous way, and we never stop to thank You for it, to recognize what You did. Lord, help us to see You, to see Your work, and to recognize You for it. Praise the Lord in Your name.